Chapter 16 The Legion. There was no path to follow as the band of travelers tiredly made their way through the dark forest. They headed further and further away from the river, and the sound of the flowing water soon fell behind them. The mule continued dragging the wagon onward with stoic determination and was led by Chino. The barge fight had taken its toll, and no one spoke as they walked, each tired from so much action in such a brief period. Soon the evening of the third day was upon them, and the group decided to set up camp for the night to start fresh the next morning. Euclidean scouted forward and found a section of trees that was positioned against a stone embankment. The bounty hunter looked around the area and determined it was safe. Chino secured the mule wagon, then began working with his master to prepare a hearth for the camp night. As Euclidean and Chino worked to build a fire, everyone found comfortable positions near this area, and provisions were handed out for the evening meal. Each person ate their share of dried rabbit meat and forest fruits, quietly lost in their own thoughts of what had transpired so recently. As Euclidean ate his food, his injured rib was aching, and his body was weary from so much walking and fighting in so short a time. To tolerate the aggravating pain of his injury, he mentally counted the great sum of wealth the band had accumulated in their travels and put together various ideas for the upcoming rescue of the farmer's wife. He hoped the farmer would be patient with the wife, who had most likely been abused many times by the bandits in the days they took to travel. Chino sat on his bedroll, looking away from the fire and considering what he should do next. Gently rubbing his aching and bandaged hands, he thought of his upcoming future. He thought of the savings of silver and gold he had put away for the last 9 seasons and dreamed of buying a small plot of land to farm. Thoughts of the imagined farm and a quiet guilt from the private secret he kept from his master filled the young bounty hunter's mind as he drifted off to weary sleep. As Euclidean ate and Chino drifted off to sleep, Aramis covered Hope with a blanket and tried to accustom himself to the short 2-sided sword he carried next to him. He had selected the sword from their recovered provisions that had not been hidden with the other weapons after he had lost his spear weapon on the barge. The young farmer gazed lovingly at Hope as she rested beside him, thinking in wonder how she had shot men with her bow and how that would likely change her forever. He wondered how the twins Kyle and Katie were, and most of all, he prayed his wife was still alive and that he would have her in his arms again soon. Aramis gazed up into the sky and uttered a silent prayer for his lost wife. "Hang on, beloved, I will find you," he vowed. Hope could not sleep, feeling on edge in the unfamiliar outdoor environment. Although she did not want to admit it, she felt great relief that her father was so near. While she was very excited to be part of a team, killing the 2 men with the arrows she had shot was more than she felt she could handle, and she quietly wept for the deaths of the men whose lives she had taken. Hidden tears fell from the exhausted girl's face, and she worked to stifle her sobs beneath the blanket that covered her. Janae oiled her bow in quiet exhaustion and realized she was no longer afraid of the unknown future. Her limbs trembled at the memory of the dirty forest bandit who had unclothed her the night before, and from the several instances of battle in the large forest they traveled in. She also thought about the kiss she and Jacen had shared, and her loins became warm at the remembered moment when Jacen had taken her roughly by the arms when kissing her. She had wanted so much to kiss him back with just as much passion, but had stopped herself at the last moment. The young huntress gazed at Jacen from her side of the fire, watching his movements. Benny stood near his auntie and gathered his throwing stones together. His bag was almost bursting. The young boy looked over at Auntie, who was staring off into space, and she seemed content for the moment. He rechecked the stones, trying to count how many he had, when he looked for Auntie and saw she was staring and was okay. Checking his rocks again, he was counting the rocks and seeing how many he might need to get, and then he checked on Auntie again. Eventually, he found he was falling sleepy, so he lay down on his blanket roll and fell asleep while trying to keep his eyes on his auntie, who kept staring at Jacen. Jacen sat by himself on the edge of the camp and looped the mantra of relaxation his master had taught him repeatedly in his mind. His birthmark began to pulsate with his heartbeat as his internal lust and rage grew hotter, moment by moment. With a suppressed groan of passion, Jacen realized the moon was passing the 3/4 divide, which always signaled the onset of his lust periods. The mantra of relaxation became everything as the whispering voices within his head mocked him from within his mind. It took all the young fighter's will not to look at Jacen or Hope, which would make him want to force them into union with him, with or without their consent. Eventually, many in the band fell into a light sleep as Euclidean, Chino, and Jacen all took turns guarding the camp. The night sounds of the great forest surrounded the group of weary travelers. The farmer watched as the Blacht Warrior Legion descended upon his village in the early light of dawn. 50 warriors moved through his village, looting the farmhouses and taking provisions without trade in the morning sun. Many of the women were heard to be screaming as the warriors took them to be ridden like animals. The villagers had fought back, and the farmhand, Guy, had joined up with his neighboring farmers to fight the warriors off. Gathering together in a hidden room, the band of resistors was made up of 30 farmers. They were armed with bows and spears, and had worked out a plan to rout the warriors into separate groups that could be ambushed or killed. Avoiding the groups of the Blacht warriors, Guy rushed back to his farmhouse to gather provisions before he set out upon his part of the ambush. As he moved into the main home, his 2 younger brothers, Garn and Roly, asked to go with him to help fight. Guy stopped his gatherings to look down at his twin brothers, who were not even in their teens yet. He knew if he brought them, they would just be killed, and wrathfully told them to stay hidden until he returned. Guy had hidden his twin brothers with his 2 aunts and ran to a hiding spot en route to the agreed-upon ambush site. Suddenly, he noticed a group of the Dark Warriors heading into his home where he had hidden the twins and his aunts. With a muffled cry, he watched as 2 Blacht Warriors brought out each of the struggling twins, who were both roughly thrown to the ground and kicked by the Blacht Warriors. With a sickening sob, Guy watched as one of the Dark Warriors held his brother Roly, forcing him to watch as the other warrior slit Garn's throat. Roly cried out as his twin brother quickly bled out. Guy screamed out a muffled cry of remorse as Garn was killed, followed by Roly. The twins' bodies were left to bleed out on the path leading to their home, and Guy quickly left his hiding spot to run into the forest, sobbing over the traumatic loss of his 2 brothers by the hands of the Blacht Warriors. I swear, sobbed Guy as he ran. I swear I will destroy you! He shrieked as he ran through the forest, away from the main path and the dying village behind him. The company of travelers awoke on the 4th day refreshed, and the group shared a brief breakfast of fresh forest berries and travel biscuits before continuing their way into the forest. Euclidean noticed the members each walked with renewed energy, and even Jacen was not as taciturn as he had been for the past several days, who was sharing a quasi-friendly conversation with Aramis as they walked. At mid-morning, they came upon a well-traveled path, and choosing to follow it, set off in a southeastern direction where smoke could be seen in a small cluster that signaled a community. The group walked through the forest along the path. Their travels took them near another section of the rushing river they had exited the day before. Suddenly, a sobbing man carrying a bow and quiver of arrows was blindly rushing through the forest, not heading in any general direction. The company stopped and watched as the stumbling man finally fell to his knees and wept openly to the trees above him, wildly beating his chest as he sobbed. Euclidean drew a short sword and cautiously approached the sobbing stranger. As the man ran out of breath from crying so hard, Euclidean used that moment to tap the man on the shoulder with his sword blade. The man drew a deep breath and screamed in fright and scrambled back away from Euclidean, who stood motionless and unsure what to do. The frightened man looked around rapidly at the travelers one by one and slowly realized they were not after him. Suddenly the man began quietly sobbing as if his heart was broken. He looked at the travelers and pleaded for their help in his sobs. He gave a garbled version of what he had seen, of how the Blacht Warriors had destroyed his village. He wept piteously as he told them the moments leading up to the death of his twin brothers, and how he had been paralyzed and unable to save them, and how he had run. He wept into his hands in a high-pitched voice and covered himself in dirt, wailing for death to take him, then fell into weeping and repeating, I swear, I swear. The company was quiet as they realized the source of the poor man's pain. He had just witnessed the death of his 2 younger brothers to the tyranny of the Blacht Warriors and was lost in grief. Jacen knelt to embrace the weeping man, who cried upon her shoulder, looking blank and lost as he wept. As she held the sobbing man to her, she looked at the group and asked, Surely there is something we can do for this poor man. Aramis addressed the travelers as the man continued to weep. He said, My companions, I understand the grief this man feels, but I cannot abandon my own pursuit to rescue my wife. I will understand if you must help this man, but Hope and I will go on alone if we have to." Euclidean glanced at the sobbing man and at Aramis, then sighed and said, "Let's build a small fire and figure out the next move." As Benny covered the weeping man with a blanket, Chino quickly built a small campfire where he and Euclidean discussed what to do about the broken man. Janae held the sobbing man to her and whispered comforting words. Hope watched the interaction, then swallowed and slowly joined Janae in holding the man. Aramis stood by his daughter, but was facing away and holding his hands out to the sky as he quietly whispered prayers. Just then, Jacen called out, "Look!" Traveling up the path toward the group of travelers was the full Blacht Warrior Legion, who was in the process of leaving the farming village after their dark appetites were sated. Riding at the head of the envoy, on a tall black dire steed, sat Commander Darstad. The red stripes of his command stood out in sharp contrast to the rest of the armored men around him. These warriors were legionnaires and wore the battle armor of the Dark Lord's infantry. The armors were sleek and made of a light metal in plate fashion, with shields and short swords made of the same alloy. Darstad and his captains rode upon dire steeds, which were a mutated combination of wrapped horse and something else. The commander noticed the mule wagon and 7 individuals near it, with 2 of the men armed with short swords. Darstad stood up in the stirrups of his saddle and held up his arm with fist closed, giving the signal for the captains to bring their squads to a halt. Instantly, 5 orders were called out by his captains, and the Legion train slowly came to a standstill 100 feet away from the group of travelers. Darstad gave another signal with his hand, and a flag bearer that portrayed the dark dragon symbol of the Dark Lord's army stepped forward and ordered the travelers to clear the road in a rough voice. Just then, Guy looked up from his stupor and saw the contingent of militia across from he and the other travelers. "I swear!" he screamed, and drew out his bow to take aim at the nearest militiaman. Just as he released the arrow, Euclidean rushed in and pushed him down, causing the arrow to fly into the air and out of danger. The Legion infantry members all reacted in unison and took up a defensive stance. Holding their shields out before them, a rough sound of scraping metal came forth as each of the platoon members drew forth a short sword. Just then, Darstad took off his helmet and shrugged his shoulders with an irritated expression on his face as he surveyed the small band of travelers. "Blanchard, kill this group," he ordered. Captain Blanchard gave the salute of obeisance and ordered his personal platoon of 10 infantrymen to move forward and take no prisoners. The rest of the Black Warriors stood motionless as the single platoon moved in. As the Black Warriors began moving toward them, Euclidean held up his hands and cried out, "Wait!" in a loud and desperate voice. The Black Warriors did not pause in their advance, and Euclidean cursed as he drew out his short swords and took up a ready stance. Chino did likewise, and noticed Jacen releasing his staff, and Janae and Hope taking up aim with their arrows. Aramis swallowed and gripped his borrowed sword as Benny stood off to the side with one of his stones in his hand. As the platoon reached 20 feet away from the travelers, they began running with a battle cry. Janae, Guy, and Hope each took up aim and shot their arrows, with Janae's taking one of the running warriors in the face, who screamed and fell to the ground, causing the warrior immediately behind him to slow in his charge. The warrior who slowed down was immediately pelted by stones thrown by Benny, and one of the thrown stones struck the warrior in the nose, breaking the cartilage underneath with a sick crunching sound, causing the man to scream in pain and grab at his face. Hope's arrow struck one of the armored warriors, but glanced off his armor ineffectively. Guy screamed obscenities each time he fired his arrows as Janae and Hope both reloaded and took up aim to fire again at the onrushing Dark Warriors. Using the wagon as a barrier, Euclidean, Chino, and Jacen all leapt into action. The onrush of Dark Warriors was stilted by the wagon, which blocked the travelers from becoming overrun. Euclidean engaged 2 of the warriors and fought both-handed, using every ounce of strength he could summon to hold the heavily armored attackers at bay. He was finally able to stab one of the attackers in the neck, only to turn and face another one. Chino fared as well, but was only able to engage the armored warriors with no killing blows. His sword strikes were glancing off the superior armor that each of the Black Warriors who faced them both wore. Jacen used his staff with great efficiency, first by throwing it and ricocheting the weapon off the helmet of one of the warriors. The weapon hummed as it arced through the air and struck the advancing warrior sharply in the helmet. The throw was accurate, and a loud electrical noise of impact was heard as the warrior fell to the ground concussed. Jacen picked up the staff from where it had landed and jumped to engage two more warriors, deftly blocking their short sword thrust with his vibrating staff and forearm protector, while spinning around, slamming the staff into his attackers' helmets with a loud electrical flash. Jacen deftly stepped over the falling bodies of the two warriors he had repulsed and began engaging a fourth. Aramis swallowed and ran to help him in some way. As he ran to join in the fighting, he tripped and fell, and his borrowed sword went flying out of his hand to land point first in the ground some yards away. Aramis righted himself and stood up. As he did so, his eyes landed on the pouch of explosives they had used before. The farmer quickly grabbed a burning branch from the campfire and ran it over to the pouch in the wagon of supplies. He grabbed the bag of black powder bombs and fumbled with the opening. As the sound of fighting came closer, in desperation he lit the entire bag on fire and threw it into the group of armored warriors nearest the wagon. A great explosion of sound rocked the forest square, and the area was filled with a dark and gritty soot that made everyone's eyes run. Blanchard and several warriors closest to the explosion were reeling back from the cloud of strange smoke, leaving only two warriors left attacking the band of travelers. Jacen quickly dispatched the warrior he was fighting with a quick combination flurry from his staff, causing the man to drop his weapon as the staff struck his hand and forehead almost simultaneously. As the warrior grabbed his forehead, Jacen slammed the vibrating staff against the man's face, causing a wet, crunching noise. The warrior fell backwards and lay on the ground unmoving, with his face a crushed and bloody mess. Euclidean engaged the final Blacht Warrior as Chino quietly crept up behind the armored warrior and suddenly pulled his head back for Euclidean to chop through the man's neck. Blood gushed in an arterial spray as the Dark Warrior fell to the ground. The sound of commands rang out, and the remaining Black Warriors took up position to advance. "Hold!" cried the leader of the Black Warriors. All the militiamen stopped and took notice as their commander Darstad addressed them. The lithe commander stepped down from his dire steed and drew out his vibro-focus weapon. "I will deal with this rabble myself. None shall attack until my order," he shouted. He removed his helmet and threw it to one of his captains, then unbuckled his breastplate and removed it along with his undergarment, which he placed upon the saddle of his dire steed. Bare-chested, the leader began summoning his internal energies and began channeling them into his strange weapon as he walked slowly toward the group of travelers while loosening his shoulders. The platoon members all began standing down as their commander slowly walked toward the members of the band with his strange weapon humming before him. Nearby, Euclidean and Chino both tensed and began to grip their weapons with greater force at the approach of the commander. Janae and Hope took aim at the other Black Warriors standing afar off, while Aramis picked up his fallen sword and held it before him in a shaking hand. Benny continuously looked at Janae, then back to the armored men around him in uncertainty. Jacen stood nearby the fallen bodies of the armored warriors he had defeated, and walked toward the advancing commander with his own vibrating staff held out before him in a defensive position. Darstad approached the brawny fighter and stopped to appraise him. The commander saw they were near each other's age and took notice of the strange vibrating weapon the fighter held out before him. Jacen looked back and glanced curiously at the weapon in the commander's hand as it hummed in its own strange way. The two men faced each other, and Darstad took up a fighting stance, holding his weapon before him. Jacen did the same, holding his staff alight. The two men circled each other quietly on a clearing, with the militia forces slowly surrounding the group and blocking the way of escape forward and back, while the rushing river blocked all escape from the side. Darstad attacked first, striking his weapon in an arc in Jacen's direction. A pulsation of force came out from the weapon, which Jacen effectively blocked with his staff, causing him to slide back several feet. Jacen recovered and immediately threw his staff at Darstad, who blocked it with his own weapon, only to have the arcane weapon knocked out of his hands. Jacen used that moment to rush at the commander and began to strike him with a series of fist and leg strikes he had practiced many times with his master. Great bursts of expelled air could be heard as Jacen attacked Darstad over and over in a grueling flurry of fists and kicks. Darstad was struck in his bare chest several times and was only able to fend off a portion of Jacen's attacks. Bloodied and face swelling, Darstad summoned his energy within him and dangerously concentrated the energy into an attack through his own body. As Jacen pummeled his fists into Darstad, the Legion commander caught the fighter's arms and savagely headbutted him, causing Jacen to stagger back and grab his face. As Jacen fell back, the commander jumped up with a great cry and brought his foot down upon Jacen, intending to power crush him to the earth. The young fighter rolled out of the way at the last moment, causing Darstad to land heavily and release his internal energy unfocused into the ground. The ground burst into a crack, and the clearing they were fighting on quickly broke apart to fall into the onrushing river. carrying both men into the tumultuous current. As the two fighters were swept away, Janae cried out, "Jacen!" and ran to the edge of the broken ground. Captain Blanchard stepped forward and watched as his commander was washed away in the rush of the river. He turned to the surrounding Black Warriors and cried out an order to wipe out the remaining stragglers. The full body of the remaining militia began marching forward in a slow fashion, and the doom of the remaining band of travelers was certain. As Janae, Hope, and Benny took up aim with their weapons, and Euclidean and Chino tensed for what seemed to be their last battle, suddenly a lithe figure landed in an explosion of energy and sound onto the ground in front of the militiamen. The explosion of sound rocked the area and caused the closest militiamen to be blasted backwards with their metal breastplates crimped inward by the force of the blast. These unlucky few were immediately crushed by their own armor, causing the rest of the marching platoon members to stumble to a halt. Kneeling at the epicenter of the explosion was a man with long silver hair, almost seemed to glow. He was dressed in a green travel cloak and carried a vibrating staff like the one Jacen used. He paused to consider the militia members that surrounded him with his body poised in a fighting stance. Blanchard recovered himself in the after effects of the strange explosion. A loud ringing was continuously heard within his ears, and he shook his head to clear it as he realized he was deafened after the explosion. His men were looking to him, and his lieutenant was mouthing words that he could not hear. With mute frustration, Blanchard cried out, "Attack! Kill them all!" All remaining platoon members rushed forward in a great battle cry, and soon the area was filled with the sounds of fighting and screaming men. The man with the glowing silver hair jumped into action and began engaging any warriors that came close to him. His attacks were delivered with superhuman precision. The travelers watched dumbfounded as the single man warded off the entire legion of militiamen. Using his staff for leverage, the man moved faster than anyone else, spinning his vibrating weapon and effortlessly batting the armored militia away from him, causing those he struck to be pushed backwards for several feet. Those that got close to him were momentarily astounded that this strange being moved quicker than they could swipe at him, making it seem as if they were clumsy children swinging sticks. The man was like a force of nature, and he moved almost too quick to follow, his strikes precise and sure, causing the Dark Warriors to fall back with great injuries from his attacks. Several times the man would shout a loud exploding force that would cause the armored warriors to be concussed back through the air. Wherever the man struck his staff, it was as if a great hammer had been used. The man left a trail of bodies behind him as he waded through the platoon members, and his attacks were causing massive dents to their great armor. Soon the remaining Legion members began to run away from him in fear of their life. Many of the Dark Warriors ripped away the armor they wore as they ran, for to be branded a retreater meant certain death from the Dark Lord. At the head of those that ran away was Blanchard, blood running from his ears to splatter on the ground next to his running feet. As the remaining Dark Warriors retreated away from the attacks of the Special Man, he stopped, then turned back to casually walk back towards the group. Euclidean stood dumbfounded near his traveling companions as he watched the stranger approach. The man walked casually, as if out for a stroll, and Euclidean noticed he was not breathing hard or perspiring despite the incredible barrage of attacks he had just witnessed the stranger perform. The glowing man approached the group and leaned on his staff with one wrist over the next. He wore a medium-length beard with sections that were braided, and his hair hung down to his shoulders. His tunic and clothing were made of a strange green-colored material that gently shimmered. The hem of his tunic ended at mid-thigh, and Euclidean could see leggings made of the same material that continued into sturdy knee-length moccasins. His countenance seemed to glow as the stranger addressed the group. "Good day, fine travelers," said the man in a deep and gentle voice. He smiled at the group with such an open expression that the travelers were immediately charmed by his manner. A sensation of total peace entered the square, where moments ago this strange being had dispatched an entire legion of Blacht Warriors. The man said, "I am a traveler like yourself, and am heading to the sordid tavern at the center of the forest nearby. Shall you join me? I find there is better safety in numbers." The travelers were dumbstruck by the implications of the stranger, but nonetheless Euclidean sheathed his short swords and approached the man. "How on earth," Euclidean began, only to be interrupted by the strange man. "All questions will just lead to more questions. Come, let us learn of one another as we travel," the sage intoned in a friendly and charming way. The travelers agreed, but just then Janae called out, "We must find Jacen!" Everyone but Guy walked rapidly to where Janae stood. Guy sank to the ground and continued to whisper, "I swear." The The group gathered at the ledge of the broken ground where Jacen had fought the Legion commander and had fallen into the river. The stranger looked over the precipice down at the raging waters below as the river rushed by. "Is your companion a strong swimmer?" he asked. Janae looked at the others in the band and realized that none of them knew enough about Jacen to answer that question. With shocked realization, she acknowledged to herself that she barely knew Jacen and now might never get the chance. The stranger's question caused tears to form in her eyes, and two streams slowly made their way down her face as she looked at the torrent of water below them. Just then, Benny cried out from the wagon and was seen pointing at a 17-year-old boy who stumbled towards them with his hands tied in front of him. He was dirty, and his hair was messed up from the unexpected travels as a prisoner of the Blacht Warrior Legion. The boy walked as if stunned or inebriated, unsure where to head as he walked by the many corpses of Blacht warriors that had been killed by the glowing stranger. Finally, the boy fell into a weary heap next to the crying guy. "Our party grows even larger," the glowing man said with a smile. As Janae continued to stare at the rushing river water, the rest of the group convened to discuss their next movements. Upon the stranger's prodding, Euclidean gave a brief description of their journey and mission, and how they sought knowledge of the whereabouts of the bandit known as Barbarous. He explained that they were looking for Aramis's kidnapped wife and planned to rescue her. The glowing stranger listened intently to Euclidean as Benny covered Janae with a blanket, and Chino and Aramis began looting the bodies of the Blacht warriors. Guy and the 17-year-old boy sat nearby the small campfire, each covered with a blanket and staring at the flames. Hope placed small rations of food next to each of the men and listened to Euclidean as he conversed with the man who had saved them from the Black warriors. "You are on a noble quest indeed," the stranger said to Euclidean as the fighter concluded his tale. "Now you seek not only to find the missing wife, but your lost companion?" he asked. "We are deciding what to do next. Maybe with your help," Euclidean said, but was interrupted by the stranger. "No, I cannot join you, as I am upon my own mission. But I can travel with you to the Sordid Tavern, where I will put you in touch with a tracker who can help you find Barbarous and your missing companion. That is where we will part ways, I'm afraid," the stranger finished. Somewhat disappointed, Euclidean agreed, then moved off to help strip the Blacht warriors that had fallen. The glowing stranger watched the large fighter walk away, and then turned to look at Guy and the boy sitting nearby. The glowing stranger approached the two men and stood among them. He looked at Guy, who sat and looked blankly at the fire in front of him with tears running down his face, then turned and noticed the boy with the same blank and weary expression. The stranger glanced around, and when he saw the others engaged in their various tasks for the moment, he quietly approached Guy. Kneeling behind the crying man, he gently placed his hands on the man's shoulders. Speaking quietly in an unknown language, the man began to concentrate the great powers of his voice. An energetic resonance pervaded the small area around the two men. As the man's strange energy surrounded the weeping man, Guy began crying out hysterically for a split second, then stopped and fell unconscious into the waiting arms of the glowing stranger. The stranger lowered the grief-stricken man to the ground and covered him with a blanket. He placed his hand on Guy's brow and whispered several words in an unknown language. He next approached the 17-year-old boy, and soon the youth was asleep and covered with a blanket. As the stranger covered the young man, he glanced up and noticed Benny watching the scene from his position of protection near Janae. The glowing man winked at Benny, then stood up and walked over toward the huntress. Benny let the man approach the girl and watched but did not react. The young woman was no longer crying but continued to search the river. "He'll be much further downstream by now, I'm afraid," the stranger said to her in a soothing tone of voice. "Perhaps he will be able to pull himself out of the water," he offered. Janae turned to the stranger and wiped her eyes as she asked, "Who are you, good sir?" The stranger appraised the young woman, then said, "A companion for a brief time." With that statement, the glowing figure walked back to the sleeping men near the campfire and stood over them in a relaxed stance, looking out at the forest that surrounded them. Euclidean, Chino, Aramis, and Hope finished the job of looting the bodies and brought the goods over to the wagon. Once again, there were too many pieces of armor and weapons to carry on with them, and these items were hidden under a shallow grave that was marked with stones by Euclidean. They also recovered a wagon that held provisions for an army and several chests of plunder that had been taken by the Black warriors. Euclidean looked at the new chests of gold and silver, jewelry, and silverware, and with dawning realization understood they were all suddenly very wealthy people, and they would need to quickly secure the treasure lest it be lost in the journey as it almost had been on many occasions. Noting the location of the upcoming tavern on his map, Euclidean started forming a plan. Just then, Hope cried out, "Look at this!" The band of travelers looked at the small message scroll she carried in her hands. Aramis took the item and unbound it and quickly read through the contents. "What does it say?" Euclidean asked the farmer. "This appears to be an order to find a boy by the name of Ija and to bring him to Cassius's northern base to await the Dark Lord," the farmer explained as he read the message. The travelers all glanced at the 17-year-old boy, who was sleeping some ways away at the campfire, while the glowing man stood nearby the boy, apparently out of earshot. "What would the Dark Lord want with a boy?" asked Hope, with a look of fear on her face. Euclidean took the message from Aramis and said, "It doesn't concern us. We will continue our mission for Aramis and try to find Jacen. The boy can go his own way after we arrive at the tavern." As he finished his statement, Euclidean dropped the message onto the fire, where it was quickly consumed by the flames into ash. "Euclidean, maybe we should help the boy," Janae said. She looked around the group at the others. "Doesn't anyone agree with me?" she asked her companions. Euclidean said, "And what should we do? Rescue the boy? We cannot go against the Dark Lord's forces. It would take an army and years of planning. We do not have any of those things," he said with intensity. "As far as I'm concerned, we would all be safer away from the boy and leave him to his fate," Euclidean said. After a moment, no one said anything, and Euclidean looked at Chino and said, "Let's move out!" The travelers gathered themselves and awoke Guy and the boy named Ija. All together, they set out for the tavern the stranger had mentioned. Janae tenderly gathered Jacen's staff and travel bag that he had dropped as the group headed away from the area. Looking at the strange Legion commander's weapon upon the ground, she ran over and kicked it away into the river, where the weapon quickly sunk below the surface of the dirty water. The forest chirped around the travelers as they continued upon the forest path, their wagon laden with treasure unbeknownst to all but those within the band. The glowing stranger strode off in the lead, walking at a gentle pace, and was followed by Chino, who pulled the mule and wagon train. The wagon was now so laden that Benny and Hope, who had previously rode within, now walked alongside the wagon with everybody else. Guy was no longer crying, and although there were lines on his face, he walked alongside the wagon, whispering, "I swear," from time to time. The 17-year-old boy had cleaned his face and looked refreshed after his short nap. He walked with a steady pace and seemed content to follow the group to the tavern at the center of the forest. Euclidean approached the glowing stranger as they walked and said, "Of course, take whatever of the plunder you wish, as we owe you our lives, and you defeated them all by yourself," he concluded lamely. The stranger smiled and said, "No, thank you. I forsook treasure long ago and bid you keep it all. Who knows, perhaps you will find some great need with your spoils." The stranger picked up his pace and moved his head to scan the forest as he walked, as if seeing things that no one else could see. Euclidean slowed in his pace and was thunderstruck as he realized the man would be taking none of the spoils for himself. He watched the stranger walk ahead and wondered, who is this glowing stranger?